a bright side somewhere. There's a bright side somewhere.
Reverend Lee used the pulpit and his printing press to encourage other blacks in the area to register to vote. Even after numerous threats, Lee persevered in encouraging blacks to exercise their right to vote, and in May of 1955 he was murdered. Lamar Smith was also involved in voter registration efforts. He was shot and killed on the courthouse lawn. There were numerous witnesses, but his killer was never indicted because no one would testify. Emmett Till, a 14-year-old boy on vacation from Chicago, reportedly flirted with a white woman in a store. 3 nights later, 2 men took Till from his bed, beat him, shot him, and dumped his body in the Tallahatchie River. An all-white jury found the men innocent of murder. John R. Reese, a 16-year-old boy, was dancing in a cafe when white men fired shots into the windows. Reese was killed and 2 others were wounded. The shootings were part of an attempt by whites to terrorize blacks into giving up plans for a new school. Willie Edwards Jr. was stopped on his way to work by 4 Klansmen. They mistook Edwards for another man who they believed was dating a white woman. Then they forced Edwards at gunpoint to jump off of a bridge into the Alabama River. Edwards' body was found 3 months later. Mack Charles Parker was accused of raping a white woman. 3 days before his case was set for trial, a mass mob took him from his jail cell, beat him, shot him, and threw him in the Pearl River. Herbert Lee, who worked with civil rights leader Bob Moses to help register black voters, was killed by a state legislator who claimed self-defense and was never arrested. Louis Allen, a black man who witnessed the murder, was later also killed. Corporal Roman Ducksworth Jr., a military police officer stationed in Maryland, was traveling to visit his sick wife when a police officer ordered him off of a bus and then shot and killed him. The police officer may have mistaken Ducksworth for a freedom rider who was testing bus desegregation laws. Paul Guihard, a reporter for a French news service, was killed by gunfire from a white mob during protests over the admission of James Meredith to the University of Mississippi. William Lewis Moore, a postman from Baltimore, was making a one-man march against segregation when he was shot and killed. Moore had planned to deliver a letter to the governor of Mississippi urging to end intolerance. Medgar Evers was the director of operations for the NAACP in Mississippi. He was leading a campaign for integration in Jackson when he was shot and killed by a sniper in his home. There's a bright side somewhere. Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley were getting ready for church services when a bomb exploded at the 16th Street Baptist Church, killing all 4 of the school-age girls. The church had been a center for civil rights meetings and marches. 13-year-old Virgil Lamar Ware was riding on the handlebars of his brother's bicycle when he was shot by white teenagers who had just come from a segregationist rally held in the aftermath of the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. Louis Allen, who as mentioned before witnessed the murder of civil rights worker Herbert Lee, endured years of threats before he was finally killed in 1964. He was making final arrangements to move north on the day he was killed. Johnny Mae Chappelle was murdered as she walked along a roadside. Her killers were white men looking for a black person to shoot following a day of racial unrest, and she happened to be the first one they found. Reverend Bruce Clunder was among civil rights activists who protested the building of a segregated school by physically placing his body in front of construction equipment. Clunder was crushed to death when a bulldozer backed over him. Henry Hezekiah Dee and Charles Eddie Moore were killed by Klansmen who believed the two were part of a plot to arm blacks in the area. Of course, there was no such plot, and their bodies were found during a massive search for other missing civil rights workers. James Earl Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Henry Schwerner were all young civil rights workers. They were arrested by a deputy sheriff and then released into the hands of Klansmen who plotted their murders. They were shot and their bodies were buried in earthen dam. Lieutenant Colonel Lemuel Penn, a Washington, D.C. educator, was driving home from Army Reserve training when he was shot and killed by Klansmen in a passing car. Jimmy Lee Jackson was beaten and shot by state troopers as he tried to protect his grandfather and mother from a trooper attack on civil rights marchers. His death led to the Selma to Montgomery March and the eventual passage of the Voting Rights Act.
Thy ransom spirit soar on wings of faith and love.
Reverend James Reeb, a minister from Boston, was part of a group of white clergymen who joined the Selma marchers after the attack by state troopers at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Reeb was beaten to death by white men as he walked down a Selma street. Viola Liuzzo, a housewife and mother from Detroit, came to Alabama to help with the Selma March after seeing televised reports of the attack at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. She was driving marchers back to Selma from Montgomery when she was shot and killed by a Klansman in a passing car. O'Neal Moore and Creed Rogers were two black deputies hired by white officials in an attempt to appease civil rights demands. Rogers and Moore were on patrol when they were blasted with gunfire from a passing car. Moore was killed and Rogers was wounded. Willie Brewster was on his way home from work when he was shot and killed by men who are members of the National States Rights Party, a violent neo-Nazi group whose members had been involved in church bombings and murders of blacks. Jonathan Daniels, a seminary student from Boston, came to Alabama to help with black voter registration. He was arrested, jailed, and then suddenly released, only to be shot by a deputy sheriff. Samuel Young Jr., a student civil rights activist, confronted a white gas station owner about segregated restrooms. Following the argument, Young was shot and killed. Vernon Dahmer, a prominent businessman in the area, made an offer on the radio that he would pay the poll taxes for all those who couldn't afford the voting fee. The night after the broadcast, his home was firebombed, and he later died from severe burns. Ben Chester White was a caretaker on a plantation and had no involvement in civil rights work. He was murdered by Klansmen who thought that they could divert attention from a civil rights march by killing a black person. Clarence Triggs was a bricklayer who had attended civil rights meetings sponsored by the Congress of Racial Equality. He was found dead on a roadside, shot through the head. Willis Jackson, the treasurer of his local NAACP chapter, received many threatening Klan notices at his job after he was promoted to a position previously reserved for whites. He was killed by a bomb planted in his car. Benjamin Brown was a former civil rights organizer and was watching a student protest from afar when he was killed by stray gunfire from police firing into the crowd. Samuel Ephesians Hammond Jr., Delano Herman Middleton, and Henry Ezekiel Smith were shot and killed by police as they fired on student demonstrators at the South Carolina State College campus. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was the most well-known and inspirational leader of the civil rights movement. He organized and led nonviolent desegregation campaigns and was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his work. He was assassinated as he prepared to lead a demonstration in Memphis.